This week in our compensation class, we're going to go through chapters 6 and 9. I think once you read both of them, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap and similarities, which is why I put them together. But I'm going to make the PowerPoint slide decks and the videos separate for each chapter. The quiz, however, will cover both chapters simultaneously. So you don't, I would read both chapters, go through all the material for both chapters, and then take the quiz. So compensation strategy is really important, and this is something we always teach in the first few weeks because the way that an organization sets up its compensation system should reflect the strategy that the organization is trying to implement. So it's a strategic tool to help those organizations meet goals. It has a changing nature of employment relationships as well, and we'll talk about that in chapter 6 and in chapter 9. It's also important because compensation or labor costs can represent up to 75 or 80% of a total organization's costs, especially in organizations that provide services, such as consulting firms, for example, finance, sometimes education, depending on how much the buildings cost for a campus. But if you have an online university, for example, most of its costs will be the labor. I think a lot of you do or will work in industries where labor costs are such a high proportion of organizational costs that having a compensation strategy is really necessary to stay competitive in your market. So when we're talking about strategy, we're talking about kind of the overall goals of the organization, and the goals can be fed through the mission of the organization. But usually what happens is as an organization grows and over time, it'll have multiple goals, and they're all related to the mission, but they may be different aspects of the mission. They may also help implement the vision that the founders or the executive team have for that organization. A mission is simply what does the organization do? A vision is what the organization would like to look like in the future. So it's trying to move from present to the future using that vision. It creates goals, and those goals are developed into strategies. So how are we going to actually implement what are we going to do to implement those goals or to make those goals a reality? And then those strategies get broken down into tactics. Within compensation, tactics are usually like department level. So a lot of times it will be HR that's implementing those tactics, but it's also managers who are doing, evaluations with employees, for example, or determining pay increases and that sort of thing. So the tactics go down to more of a department level or team or even group level. It could even be on individual managers to implement those tactics. This is a reciprocal relationship, however. Performance affects plans and those influence strategies and goals. So you can have goals and the organization can implement these strategies through tactics. And if they see that performance is either increasing, they might do more of that stuff. Their goals might increase. And then they'll implement more strategies that do the same kind of thing with employees. It may also be that they find that employees are not as productive, or they're not making as much money, or they're not meeting their goals. And then they have to go back and figure out how do we change our strategies to meet these goals. Another thing or another reason that you have to go back and maybe revise strategy is that things can change in the environment that can affect your strategy. It may even affect your goals higher up. So something like an economic downturn or a recession can lead organizations to go back and figure out, okay, we're in a different economic time than we were when we determined what strategies we were going to implement this year or the next few years. Let's go back and revise those strategies to account for the fact that we're in a recession. So it might be harder, for example, to hire people in some of the ways that we want to because we just don't have the money to be able to pay for them, for example. So that's the reciprocal relationship. We also have a changing environment. Our economy in the US is changing from manufacturing to services to a more globalized economy where our workers are often competing with workers in other countries to do work remotely or do highly analytical work or do very skill-based work where you have to have specific skills to do the work. There's also an impact of technology. We have more information, which this book has emphasized many times. We have more information about compensation, for example, which means that we can negotiate potentially better market rates for ourselves or negotiate better pay for ourselves based on those market rates. But it also means that organizations also have more information about what's going on in the market and about compensation more generally. We have faster access to the information, and we also have compressed timeframes for the information that we get. So the book mentions salary. Surveys. These are surveys of companies asking how much they pay for different positions. These are becoming more common or more often. So when businesses have to fill out this information or give this information to a company, they'll ask for it more often than they used to because things are changing at a much quicker pace. Um, I don't think I make us read the chapter about these market surveys, but the reason that organizations would give this kind of information to an organization is that they also get back the information about what other competitors are paying for similar positions. So it's a win-win for both groups, but it does mean it's getting faster because of technology. Organizations are also responding to changes in technology, to the economy, just to the way that work is working now, so that we have flatter organizations. There's more downsizing. You'll see layoffs seem to be much more common than they used to be, and they aren't always around just recessions. And there's also an increased flexibility in changing the jobs and the kind of work that people do. And then employment contracts have evolved, and I'm sure this is something that most of you have thought about or have even encountered. Maybe your parents or grandparents were able to stay in the same company for most of their careers. That's not really how most of us will work. It's not the way work is structured now, and it's not an expectation that employees have. So we have more market-based relationships where we move from organization to organization to increase our pay. But that also means that with technology, for example, we have more information about what that market pay is, so we can use that as we're moving from organization to increase our own compensation. So the goals of compensation seem pretty easy. They're actually really hard to implement, but we want to attract and retain employees. We want to motivate and engage employees once they're in our company. And we also need to keep labor costs in line with organizational needs. And one thing I really like about this book that's maybe unique compared to some of the other HR books I've read around compensation is that it really talks about how outside forces force organizations to pay their workers differently. So let's talk about that as we go through the slide deck in chapter 6. So one thing that organizations kind of higher level have to think about is their pay level strategy. And one thing I do like about chapter 6 is it's organized from broad to very specific. So very broadly, organizations have to think about what is the average compensation they're going to pay to their employees. And as the book mentions, it may not be the same. Your pay level strategy may not be the same for all employees in your organization. You can change this up for different groups of employees depending on how easy it is for you to find those employees, how much they matter to the core mission or the core work that the organization does. What is the market like for finding these employees and how much are they paid, that sort of thing. But usually this is where that market survey can be very helpful. It helps organizations compare their pay, their average pay with other organizations as well. One thing to keep in mind though is average compensation reflects how funds are allocated within the organization, and they are affected by how much money the organization is bringing in. So high wage employers are employers that pay higher wages than other competitors in the market. They tend to be larger size. So these are your more established companies. A lot of them are the kinds of companies that come to K-State when they're trying to recruit students. Places like Coke, for example, or some of these large tech companies like Apple or Google would be a high wage employer. They usually have higher profits. And their higher profits can come from the fact that they've been in their industry for so long that they've really developed a reputation and they have services or products that customers really want. But it can also be that they have diversified into many different businesses, so they have lots of streams of revenue coming in and lots of profit centers within their organization. They have a lower ratio of labor costs to total costs. So their labor costs are not 75 or 80% of their budget. It's more like 50 or 60% or even lower if they're in manufacturing or something where you have to have a lot of capital on hand. They have few industry competitors, and they're often unionized, especially at lower levels of the organization, like manufacturing, for example. The advantages, and you can probably imagine what these are for a high wage employer, is that by paying higher wages, they get higher worker quality in hiring. But they also, when employees are in their organization, they have the ability to insist on higher performance standards. So they can expect more out of their employees. and expect those employees to spend more time on developing their skills and professional development to keep pace with the changes within this larger organization. They tend to have lower turnover. Management saves time with compensation because they don't have to consider it as frequently. And when they say consider it as frequently, it means that employees aren't usually trying to negotiate their salaries higher as often, but also they may just do once a year changes in salary because they're already above the market level. They have insurance against unionization for either the levels of the organization that aren't already unionized, or if there's no unionization at all, by paying higher wages, their employees tend to be more satisfied with their pay and are less likely to seek out a union to try to negotiate for better pay with their organization. They also have fewer labor disputes when they are in unionized companies because they're often, I mean, they're paying above market levels, so it's usually more than the union's expecting. And then, of course, the reason I can say that some examples of high wage employers is they tend to have a prestige within their industry, but also overall across companies, so that some of these large companies that are really good high wage employers are well known for that, and they attract employees simply because of that reputation. In contrast, low-wage employers tend to be relatively small. So these, for example, startups tend to be low-wage employers, or small family firms, for example. And that's just because they don't have the kind of revenue streams that large employers have to pay higher wages. They often occupy a competitive product markets. And so an example would be something like retail, like Walmart. Walmart is a low wage employer, but partially one reason maybe just their strategy, that is just a strategy they chose. But part of the reason that Walmart is a low wage employer is that they are an extremely competitive product market where their profit margins are not very high. Another example might be restaurants. A lot of people in restaurants don't get paid very well, partially because of the way that we set up pay for servers, where they're really reliant on tips, but also because restaurants generally don't have a very big profit margin either. So they really just can't pay more wages to their employees. They're also often non-unionized, which means that there's not a union to help negotiate higher wages for employees in these organizations. The low paying ability comes from their constraints on their product market. So employees tend to go to these kinds of employers when they don't have a lot of skills or they need training to do their jobs. Low-wage employers might be willing to do that because they're kind of plucking whoever they can get who's willing to take that lower pay to do those jobs. And it could also be people with some expertise in those product markets and understand that they're not going to be paid as much as people in other industries. So an example is I used to work at Kohl's, and the people who were managers at Kohl's got paid a fair wage, but they knew they could have been paid more if they had gone into another industry like finance or insurance or something where they could work their way up as well. But the work is very different, and also some of them had already come from other retailers, so they had some knowledge of the industry, and that's why they were staying in that industry to move up in their careers. Um, when the economy changes, that's where the difference between high wage employers and low wage employers can change as well. So, when the economy is doing really well, low wage employers can earn more money, and so they are able to also increase their pay a little bit. But that might decrease the difference between low and high wage employers potentially. But in a downswing, low wage employers have some benefits to that because they get more and better applicants because fewer people have jobs. They've lost their jobs. Some of them may have lost jobs at higher pay employers. And there's less turnover because people know that they can leave that job, but they may not be able to find another job. In that sense, low wage employers don't have to pay as much because people already need jobs, and so they're willing to take lower wage jobs. And that can increase the difference between high wage employers and low wage employers during a recession. We also market rate employers, and this is becoming more and more common. These kinds of employers, they balance competitiveness with the market with cost control by using market rates, which kind of, for a lot of positions, that's sort of the absolute minimum that you need to pay to be able to attract the kinds of employees you want in your organization. Employers with open markets, and when the book says open markets, because it's an economic textbook, they don't always define these terms very well. What that means is if you have employees or a type of employee that you need, and there are lots of them out in the market, that's an open market where they're competing with each other for different positions in different organizations. When you have that kind of market, think about Walmart, for example. There, a lot of people don't need specific skills to work in Walmart, so that's an open market for them. Same for restaurant jobs. You can fill these jobs from the outside then. You can just pluck whoever you need to fill those positions. You might need to give them some minimal training, but then they can do the jobs. Employers with closed markets, and closed markets can be markets where there's just not a lot of employees in those specific categories. So it's really hard to just find someone. Or you're going to have to use like a headhunter, for example, to find a specific person for a specific position. It could also be that these are markets where the people have very specific skills that they've developed in very specific ways. And so there's just not very many of them. And it's very difficult to develop employees that you need with these kinds of skills. In that case, that's a closed market and you'll fill your jobs from within your organization because you will have taken a lot of time. But you also will probably be paying very well to keep people who there's either not a lot of people in that specific job out in the market for you to choose from, or they have very specific skills that would be hard for other employees to develop. An organization can have several compensation level strategies for different organizational units, locations, or employee groups. This is very common when you have very different kinds of jobs within your organization. And so then you can distinguish employee groups by their importance to the mission of the organization. The more important that employee group might be to the mission, so they do the core work, or they're managers or leadership that are managing lots of people to do that work, you are more likely to have a market rates for those positions. You may, depending on if the position is very specific, it might be an internal rate, but you're going to make sure that you're competitive with others in the market for those employees. You have to be aware that the compensation levels of what the compensation levels are for those different levels and who like what kinds of employees you have in those levels to make sure that you're not creating discrimination in your workplace. A really good example, I do a lot of research on gender in the workplace, and in a lot of organizations, especially male-dominated organizations or industries where most of the employees, or at least more than 50% are men. What happens is women may be 50% of the entry level employees, but as you move up in the organization, it's fewer and fewer women and there's more men. Well, if you have different ways, you've grouped your jobs in different ways to have some that are internally competitive and some that are market rate competitive. If those if the lowest paying employees are market rates, like your entry level employees, but then others have higher rates of pay simply because you're doing like an internal pay system for everyone above entry level. If you It's very possible that you could have someone who loses their job or who thinks they're underpaid and can sue the company for discrimination. And all they have to prove is that there's a disparate impact, that more women are in these entry level positions that are lower paid than other positions in the company, but like unfairly so for the kind of work that they do. And it may or may not be hard for them to show that. So that's why we're learning a lot of this stuff, because when you're in HR, then you document how you created your compensation system. And then you are constantly checking to make sure that it doesn't look discriminatory or isn't treating different employees very, very differently based on kind of the strategy and the goals that you had for your compensation system.